Hello folks, welcome to another Tale of Two Tones. Today I'm going to delve into a very big name in the world of guitar playing, Mr. Pete Townshend. But before I do so, let me please remind you to like this video, comment down below with your thoughts, and make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. So today is another big name in the guitar world. As I say, I'm going to focus on a couple of rigs from a couple of different points in time of Mr. Pete Townshend of The Who. One of my favourite guitar players, one of the most iconic guitar players of all time as well, certainly from the British rock scene. And he actually, is responsible for a lot of very crucial developments in guitar gear throughout the year, from the very earliest days of The Who, where they needed bigger, louder and more powerful amplifiers, and turned to Jim Marshall to provide that. Throughout the course of his career, Pete has always kind of been striving to just constantly refine and evolve his sound. But as a player himself, he's got a very definitive voice, not only with his guitar but also his songwriting. And I always felt that his sound has always evolved very nicely over time to match those kind of different projects that he's been working on and the kind of different ideals that he's followed with the music. So the gear, while remaining in the same kind of tonal camp, his gear has shifted to suit different versions of what he's going for. So the two rigs that I'm going to nail it down to in this video, I think, are two of the most iconic sounds that he's ever had. I'm not going for an exact replication of any tone, but I am going to try and get pretty close to a couple of different defining eras of guitar tone of each player. So what I want to do is visit the very late 60s to very early 70s kind of a period, with the Gibson SG Special and the HiWatt type of an amplifier. The Live at Leeds thing, basically, which in my opinion is one of the very best guitar tones I've ever heard. And then also I want to focus on his later era tones, which he's actually still pretty much using unchanged to this day for around 2 decades, I would say, which is the Fender Strat into a Fender style amplifier with a couple of pedals on the floor. As I say, the most important thing about this sound in particular is Pete Townshend's guitar playing and his guitar style. You hear that it's very much unchanged since his earliest days, because he really pioneered a very specific way of playing, a very dynamic way of playing. And I think it's always the case that some of the best guitar tones in history are born out of necessity of having just to compete for volume in a band. So, when you've got Keith Moon behind you, as I said, those earliest days of needing more powerful amplifiers with those Marshalls and later on the HiWatts, that just gave birth to one of the best rock tones of all time. So I'm going to try and touch on that in this video. In more recent years, when that's not been the case, unfortunately, when Keith Moon hasn't been in the band and it's not been quite so hectic, I think his tones have become a little bit more refined with the Strat and the Fender amp. And so it's shown a slightly different side of Pete's playing, but it's still Pete Townshend, it still sounds like him, and it still sounds like what The Who is best known for, which is loud, raucous rock and roll. Okay, so as always, we're going to get into the two different rigs, and I want you to let me know in the comments whether you prefer rig A or rig B. Okay, let's jump into rig A. Now for this particular one, there was no question at the direction that I wanted to go in. I wanted to get as close as I could to what I think may be the greatest, certainly live, guitar tone ever recorded in a rock context, which is the Live at Leeds 1970 kind of period, when Pete Townshend was famously using his Gibson SG Specials, most of which he ended up destroying, regrettably, but at that time he was playing SG Specials through HiWatts, and that's a very, very hard tone to get, not only because HiWatts are pretty much the only things that sound like HiWatts. There aren't many other amps on the market that do attempt to get close to that tone and that response, and also the fact that to get those tones accurately you have to just play a 100-watt amplifier full on. You have to pin it, and really the magic of that tone is just how loud that amp was in the room. So much so that a lot of the tone actually comes from the reverb of the room. So a lot of those great classic rock tones were recorded that way. It's a bit of a challenge, but as soon as I saw this guitar come into stock very recently, I knew that the challenge had to be laid down. So this is a Gibson Custom Shop 1963 SG Special. Not quite the same spec as the later 60s guitars that Pete was using with the batwing pickguards, but tonally it gets pretty close with the same kind of P90 sound. The hardest part was to nail down the amp, so I decided to go with what I actually used as a substitute for a HiWatt, if you've seen our Inspired by David Gilmour video, which is this Orange Rockerverb 100. For the Pete Townshend thing, as I said, it's all about cranking an amp to its absolute maximum. And I think the Rockerverb with 4 EL34s in its power section sounds suitably British, and it also doesn't have that Marshall kind of overly saturated, caving in kind of sound. His sound was very strident, it was very well held together, very tight, and very responsive to the great pickups on this guitar. So what you're going to hear throughout the course of this clip is basically the orange on the clean channel cranked all the way up, but I am using the attenuator on board, which is a great feature on this amp. A little bit of the reverb on board as well to kind of get some of that roominess that the Live at Leeds album has. And also you're going to hear how responsive it is to when I turn down the guitar's volume controls on both pickups. I'm also using a couple of choice effects on the floor, again to get some of those sounds as close as I could. Namely, I've got the full tone Octafuzz. Pete used, I believe, a Univox Super Fuzz on that record, but it's the same kind of a thing, quite a nasty sounding octave up kind of a sound. The Octafuzz from Full Tone does a very good job of that. And I've also got the Bell Epoch Cattle-Inbred Echoplex delay going as well, just for a couple of more rhythmic and atmospheric stuff that he used an Echoplex Live for. So, you know, in previous Tales of Two Tones, I've not gone for exact recorded or album or live tones, but in this case I just felt this was such a pivotal sound for Pete Townshend, was his live tone around 1969 and 70, that I wanted to try and get as close as I could to that. So what you're going to hear, hopefully, does it some justice. Okay, so let's move into rig B now. So this is a little bit of a harder one to nail down. With that first rig, I had a real definitive idea of the tone I wanted to go for, that live at Leeds thing that I was talking about. And what's interesting is that from that point on, you saw a real constant evolution of gear in Pete's rigs. So throughout the course of the 70s and the 80s, obviously he started out the 70s with the Who's Next album, when he went famously to the Gretsch guitar with the Fender Bandmaster 3x10 combo amp that Joe Walsh gifted to him. And then from that point onwards, especially when it came to the live rigs, it was constantly changing. You saw a bevy of different amplifiers from Mesa Boogie, the Schecter guitars, you saw those Gibson Les Paul Deluxe guitars with the mini humbuckers. Most importantly, I think, is the rig that he's settled on now for the past probably 2 decades. That's what I kind of want to focus on today, is when Pete Townshend decided to settle on basically a Fender Strat into a clean Fender amplifier. And what's nice about the rig that I've pieced together today is it's actually quite poetic in a way, because I've gone for the Dr. Z Z Master, which is the new Joe Walsh signature amplifier, which is basically a replication of a 3x10 59 Bandmaster, which is the amp that he gifted to Pete Townshend. So there's a kind of pleasing circularity to all this, and just plugging it in with this Fender Custom Shop 56 Master Design Strat with a mid boost on the floor to simulate the mid boost that is in Pete Townshend's custom Strats. It was pretty much there straight away. Now the most important thing I would say, and probably more so than any of the other players I've featured on this series so far, is that Pete still sounds like Pete whatever he's playing through. So even nowadays, despite the gear being different, it still sounds like the same player. But there is a difference with the Strat, with the mid boost, which today is coming from a Sir Coco boost reloaded, and the Fender style amplifier. I mean, Pete's been using Fender Vibro Kings, but more recently he's gone to Lazy J's and stuff like that, which actually are much closer to those original tweed Fender, like the Bandmaster kind of a tone. He's kind of gone right back to that early Who's Next kind of a thing. So, you know, there is a difference in tone. This tone is a lot thicker than that original SG and the HiWatt type thing. It also, obviously, it's a lower wattage amplifier, so it kind of breaks up a little bit more, but in a different way. It's a slightly more contained sound. But with the mid boost pedal, I think it's a thicker sound as well. I really think Pete's got some of his best tones in recent years, particularly on stuff like the Live 8 gig back in the mid noughties. And as an aside, my first ever gig that I went to was to see The Who around 2006, and I remember thinking, even back then as a very young attendee, that it was an amazing sound, an amazing guitar sound, and he's still using it pretty much in the same way to this day. So this rig is kind of an approximation of that, though as always it's not a dead-on replication. But this particular custom shop Strat with that Dr. Z amp and the Sir Coco boost on the floor gets very close to what Pete is using. The only other thing I've got in the chain is the Wampler reflection reverb pedal, just to emulate a little bit of that spring type reverb that Pete would get from his Vibro King amps. So there we are. I hope that you've enjoyed the two tones I've presented to you today for Mr. Pete Townshend. It's quite a tricky one, as I said. Despite having a couple of real identifiable tones I wanted to go for, as I said, there's just a myriad of different sounds that he's had. He's such an incredible textural musician that he's had a lot of different permutations of his guitar rig. There's so many different staples that you could choose to go for, but I think these two kind of best represent what he's about. So I hope you've enjoyed my takes on these two sounds. If you'd like to find out any more information about any of the bits of gear that I've used in this video, then click the link down below in the description and head to peachguitars.com to do so. As I said before, please leave a like and comment down below with your thoughts. Make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel if you would please, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.